At noon, Titanic's whistle sounded as she lay tied up to the White Star dock in Southampton, announcing her imminent departure. Second-class passenger Lawrence Beasley had witnessed a few stokers disembark the ship just before noon to hurriedly grab one last pint before departure and an inevitably dry voyage. The gang was racing back to Titanic just as the liner was departing. 2 of the men made it and were allowed back aboard, but 3 others were slowed by a passing train separating them from the gangplank, and they were deemed too late and thus were left in Southampton and lost out on their wages. Shortly thereafter, the orders from the bridge to cast off from the dock were made known. The orders were communicated by megaphone, the analog kind, to the men on the docks, who released the mooring lines and let them go into the water to be pulled back onto the ship. In this famous photograph, only one line remains connecting Titanic to shore, and it is slack about to be dropped into the water. Meanwhile, the tugboats on the water began to help Titanic away from the dock. Here, you can see a line coming from the hawse pipe, which was connected to a tug to help maneuver Titanic during her departure. The tugs carefully eased Titanic forward, turning her a little to port toward the River Test and the deep water channel in the middle of it. Titanic's helm was hard to starboard to assist with the maneuver. Tied up to the southern end of the dock, beyond the knee, was White Star Line's own RMS Oceanic, and tied up to Oceanic, double parked if you will, was the old liner of 1888, SS New York. First-class passengers Colonel Archibald Gracie and Mr. Isidore Strauss were standing up on either the A-deck promenade or the boat deck above, chatting while Titanic got underway. Strauss saw SS New York tied up to the dock and pointed her out to Colonel Gracie, saying that he had sailed on that ship a long time ago when she was regarded as one of the world's most advanced ocean liners. Little did he know that the SS New York, which was less than a quarter the size of Titanic, was about to become a dangerous obstacle to his current ship's maiden voyage. At this point, Titanic was nearly in a position to continue on her way under her own power, and some of the tugs had moved out of her way, while others stayed with her or hovered close by. Titanic's pilot, George Bower, ordered her engines slow ahead from the bridge, and her 2 outboard propellers began churning soon after. This churning resulted in the complex movement of water beneath the surface, partly due to the shallow depth of the water, which put a tremendous force on the nearby SS New York. It did not take long for the hawsers holding SS New York to the docked RMS Oceanic to suddenly and violently snap, knocking some people on SS New York to the deck. All 6 hawsers holding New York to Oceanic were easily broken. Then, when the New York started to pull away, Oceanic too was affected by this force, listing enough to dislodge a gangway connecting her to shore. Thankfully, Oceanic remained secure. This photograph was taken by Catholic priest and photographer Francis Browne from the port side of the boat deck as the SS New York was pulled towards Titanic by the currents. From where he stood, he heard the ringing of the telegraphs on the bridge, used to communicate with the engineers below. The order was to stop engines. But it was too late. SS New York's stern was still on a collision course with Titanic's port quarter. From Titanic's poop deck, an officer called out with a megaphone to the tugboat Vulcan, telling her captain to move to Titanic's port side to help push her stern out and away from the loose SS New York. Simultaneously, the telegraphs on the bridge rang again, ordering the engineers to throw the port propeller into reverse. While the tugboat Vulcan was now on the port side of Titanic, someone called out from the larger liner, telling the tug's captain to position his boat between the 2 ships to push SS New York back toward the dock. But the captain thought this idea foolhardy and instead raced to attach a line to New York's stern to slow her down. This first line snapped under the strain, but a second line worked, and Vulcan was starting to slow the movement of the New York. Still, collision looked inevitable to many onlookers, officers included. But at just about the last moment, thanks to the combined efforts of Titanic's crew and the tugboat Vulcan, it appeared that New York's momentum had slowed enough to avert collision. Exactly how close the 2 ships got to one another isn't clear, but witness accounts put it as close as 4 feet. While it probably wasn't that close, it was certainly close enough to nearly have ended Titanic's maiden voyage before it even began. Once things were under control, Titanic stood still for a moment, not moving at all in the middle of Southampton water. Meanwhile, tugs took hold of SS New York and brought her around the corner to the very end of the dock where she tied up, her bow protruding 100 feet beyond the eastern end. Extra hawsers were added to Oceanic, so as to avoid a repeat situation, and then Titanic continued down the river. Vulcan pulled up alongside her to take off some extra crew members via E-deck. All of this chaos had been captured on film by amateur cinematographer William Harbeck from the decks of Titanic, but that footage was lost along with its creator in the sinking a few days later. Titanic continued down Southampton water, and as she approached the Solent, lunch was served. Passengers did not linger at lunch though, as there were much more interesting things to see up on deck. There would be plenty of time to socialize and relax later in the voyage. To enter the Solent required a complicated reverse S-turn maneuver, for which pilot George Bower remained on board to assist with. This is the same maneuver which resulted in the collision between Titanic's sister ship Olympic and the HMS Hawk the year before, and interestingly, Captain Edward Smith and pilot George Bower were in command of Olympic at the time of that collision, as they were aboard Titanic during her maiden voyage. Titanic slowed to 11 knots and her central propeller, powered by the turbine engine, was stopped, and her whistle was sounded to make the imminent maneuver known to surrounding vessels. Thankfully, there were no issues with the S-turn maneuver this time, and Titanic entered the Solent safely, albeit about an hour behind schedule due to the earlier SS New York incident. Even though continuing westward around the Isle of Wight was the more direct way to Titanic's next destination, Cherbourg, France, she proceeded around the eastern side of the island because her deep draft required the deeper channel to the east. Once Titanic reached Nab Light, she turned to the south-southwest and increased her speed to 20 knots. The Cherbourg breakwater was 65 miles away, and Titanic had time to make up. The next few hours were the first moment of relative relaxation for passengers. Some stayed out on deck, although it was a little cold, while others took the opportunity to explore what they could of the huge ship. The weather was choppy, but for those aboard the sturdy Titanic, you would never have known it. For some of the crew, there was a problem which needed to be attended to: a fire in the starboard side coal bunker within boiler room number 5. The passengers knew nothing of the situation, which was certainly a good thing. While the fire was a problem which needed to be dealt with, it was not an imminent threat to the safety of the ship, and rumors of a fire could have caused unnecessary panic. The plan was to prioritize the use of coal from the effective bunker, so as to find the source of the fire and extinguish it as soon as possible. In the meantime, there was little else that could be done. In Cherbourg, soon-to-be passengers were congregating. The mood was cheery aboard the boat train from Paris, only to be dampened slightly by the news that the world's largest liner, and their means across the Atlantic, was running behind schedule and had not yet arrived in Cherbourg. The delay was moderate, though, and before long, Titanic's funnels appeared over the top of the harbor's breakwater. At 18:30, Titanic dropped anchor inside the breakwater. Dinner was being served in the saloons, and the sun would set about 20 minutes later, as passengers from shore were coming aboard. The passengers were transported to the liner via 2 tenders, specifically designed to serve Olympic and Titanic in Cherbourg, where the ships were unable to dock. These tenders were the Traffic and the Nomadic. Traffic was the smaller of these tenders and was intended for third-class passengers as well as mail and cargo. She tied up to Titanic first on this particular occasion. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the baggage handlers of the Traffic were rough with the luggage of the third-class passengers, as one of Titanic's passengers looking down noted. Sounds familiar. As Traffic let go of Titanic and headed back to shore, she passed her larger running mate, Nomadic, which was carrying the first and second-class passengers, in separate sections of the vessel, of course. Nomadic tied up alongside Titanic at about 1900, and passengers began boarding the liner via a gangplank leading to the first-class entrance and reception room on D-deck. In total, 274 passengers boarded Titanic in Cherbourg, 172 via Nomadic, and 102 via Traffic, although both vessels could accommodate far more passengers. A few minutes after 2000, Titanic weighed anchor and made way for the open English Channel. But of the passengers who were inside and not looking through the window or porthole, many did not notice the departure. Francis Browne, the priest who was traveling in first class and taking photographs of the ship, was at his table in the dining saloon when one of his dinner companions wondered aloud if the ship had gotten underway, not having noticed the start of the engines. A steward had overheard and stopped to inform the table that they had left Cherbourg 10 minutes earlier. Titanic was on her way to her second port of call, Queenstown, Ireland, which is present-day Cove, Ireland. By now, it was dark, and the journey to Queenstown was quite a bit longer than the cross-channel trip to Cherbourg. As passengers began to retire for the night after a hectic sailing day, Titanic's officers, engineers, and stokers brought the ship's speed up to nearly 21 knots. They were still behind schedule, but the trip to Queenstown offered an opportunity to catch up. At midnight, the ship's clocks were turned back by 25 minutes to compensate for her westward travel. By dawn, Titanic was only about halfway to Queenstown, sailing past Land's End. It was a cold day, and many passengers chose to explore or just enjoy the interior spaces of the ship to stay warm. Some people took the opportunity to write letters home before the ship left Europe and started across the Atlantic. Among these was Chief Officer Henry Wilde, who wrote to his sister saying, quote, "I still don't like this ship. I have a queer feeling about it." These were the words of the ship's second-in-command, and some passengers shared the same sentiment, but generally, the passengers were enthused to be aboard such a grand liner. By the late morning, around 11 o'clock, Titanic approached the entrance to Queenstown Harbor, where she paused to rendezvous with the harbor pilot, who would guide Titanic into the harbor with his niche expertise of the local waters. By 11:30, Titanic was at anchor within Queenstown Harbor. But before Titanic could even come to a stop, the first tender, America, was already alongside the liner. America tied up to Titanic's port side. The second tender, called Ireland, joined Titanic on the starboard side. Nearly all of the passengers who went aboard Titanic at Queenstown were third-class immigrants, a total of 113. Beyond that, there was naturally a lot of mail going across, as well as 3 first-class and 7 second-class passengers. Some passengers also disembarked at Queenstown, including Father Francis Browne and his camera full of photographs, who went ashore via the tender Ireland. Titanic weighed anchor one final time at 13:30, making the call at Queenstown a total of 2 hours. The final passenger count for the transatlantic crossing was 324 first, 284 second, and 709 third-class passengers, plus 891 crew for a total of 2,208 souls. Titanic paused briefly outside of Queenstown Harbor to allow the pilot to disembark, and by that afternoon, Titanic was steaming west from the coast of Ireland with nothing out ahead of her but ocean.